forgotten to give you this little bit of terminology earlier that you'll need just so that you know what I'm talking about when I'm telling you to abduct your, your hip or something like that. Who to what? The obturator foramen is what you're thinking of.
No.
Yeah. All right. Here they are. We're going to go through them. So there's two general types of motion that we're going to be principally concerned with. Angular motion, it's just like an angle, and then rotations. And then there's some special movements that aren't as important, but we'll go through them anyways. Just so you know all the ways in which your body moves. First, the angular motion. There is flexion, extension, and hyperextension. Flexion is simply bringing so any angle is made of 3 points, right? The vertex and the two other points. And as you're closing an angle, flexion just means bringing the two arms of the angle closer together, okay? So, for example, this person is flexing their arm, flexing. Extending your arm is widening the angle. And this is all within the anterior to posterior plane. All right. So So this is flexion. Here's flexion, flexion of the hip, but that flexion of the knee and hip. All right. Extension of the knee. This is all anterior to posterior. All right. From anatomical position. It's all in reference to anatomical position. Hyperextension means opening up the angle even wider beyond anatomical position. So here is flexion of the hip, extension of the hip, hyperextension of the hip. Okay? Flexion of the neck, extension of the neck, hyperextension of the neck. Wrists, etc. Is that fairly straightforward? Yeah. Okay, and then now is in the lateral to medial plane. Lateral to medial plane. There is abduction, which is a deviation away from the midline. And adduction is bringing it closer to the midline. That's really all there is to abduction and adduction. Because the words are so similar, you will often hear people say abduction. Abduction is just abduction, or adduction will be adding. And the other way you can think about this is if someone is abducted, God forbid, to abduct one is to take them away, right? Is to take them away. And so, hey, Tim.
Are we setting up in here?
No.
Okay.
No, we were going to set up in there.
This room here?
Yeah, that room there. I'm just going over a couple things with them.
Yeah, we'll get it up.
Yeah. The one thing the dance people would ask is that we take off our shoes in there. So, yeah, to abduct just means to take it away from the midline, to pull it away from the midline. Does that make sense? And to adduct is just adding it to the midline. You add something to something when you add, right? That makes sense. And so adduction is just adding it to the midline. So you can abduct the hip or adduct the hip. There is hyperadduction. This is a hyperadduction, for example. So here's abduct, adduct, hyperadduct. All right, because you're taking it beyond the midline. So abduct, adduct, hyperadduct. Or, it's a little bit hard to hyperadduct the arm. I didn't put that on there, but that's what that is. And then with the fingers, it's a little weird because you're in your extremities, but the fingers are the only things that you can abduct and adduct. And that just means bringing them, the midline is your middle finger. So bringing them towards the middle finger or away from the middle finger. Okay. Abduct, adduct. There is circumduction. Now, circumduction is confusing because it sounds like it would be a type of rotation. It's not. This is not rotating this joint. It's actually changing. It's an angular motion. It's changing. It's not rotating the femur at all. It's just changing the angle at which the femur attaches to the glenoid fossa in the scapula. All right, so we call this circumduction. And the shoulder, you can circumduct the shoulder. All right. And so now that was angular motions. Now on to rotational motions. There's medial rotation and lateral rotation. So medial rotation means rotating something towards the midline, and externally rotation or lateral rotation means rotating it away from the midline. I should get some better pictures here, but so for example, laterally rotating the hip means going like this. Medially rotating it means doing that to it. Medially rotating the shoulder is like this. Lateral rotation of the shoulder. Okay. And then the arm can have medial or lateral rotation. That has its own language that we'll see right here. We can call this pronation or supination, and I already told you about that, right? To be supine means to have your hands cupped, like begging. So to supinate, like a suppliant, is a person like please. So to supinate or to pronate. All right, guys, got a little soul patch. On to this. A little bit there. And in the foot, it used to be called pronation and supination of the foot. Those terms are not used any longer. We use inversion and eversion. So inversion is bringing the ankle towards the midline, and eversion is bringing it away from the midline. There is dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. These are some special movements. So that's just dorsiflexion is bringing the ankle upward, and plantar flexion is bringing it down. Because we're not really, the angle is a little bit confusing there. So they just call it, they're all flexions. They're not extensions. It's dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. And then lastly, there's opposition. And that's just bringing the thumb across to your finger. Yes, ma'am?
How come they got rid of the pronation, supination for feet?
Because to supinate your foot, to actually supinate your foot, you would have to be able to turn your foot so that, I'm not going to do it because I have a slightly sprained ankle already. I don't want to dislocate it. It would be to turn your ankle so it was facing up. And our feet just don't do that. That joint just doesn't work that way. It's inverting it and everting it. So it's actually traveling in the frontal plane. If it were pronating and supinating, it would be rotating. It would be a rotation into the frontal plane. It's not doing that. It's an angular motion. Does that make sense? Yeah. It was just, I don't know. It whatever it was. That's what it is now. Okay, and then the jaw has a few of its own descriptors. There's retraction and protraction, moving the jaw forward and back. Depression and elevation of the jaw, opening it and closing it. It's not really that relevant to us. But this one's very relevant. So we will be measuring some lateral flexion today. And this lateral flexion is bending the torso in the frontal plane. So from one side to it'll be right. Left lateral flexion, right lateral flexion. Okay? And this is anterior flexion. This is flexion of the trunk. This is extension of the trunk. Okay, so without hinging my hips, this is flexion of the trunk and extension of the trunk. I think that's all I have in there. That's it.